Okay. Chapter 10 starts out with a vignette about Tecumseh. Tecumseh was a very persuasive talker, an eloquent speaker. He was an Shawnee Indian chief who grew up with the American Revolution and the violence. He had a brother known as the Prophet. Now, folk, the Prophet got his reputation because he predicted an eclipse. Now, any of you who know anything at all about astronomy know that eclipses can be predicted hundreds of years in advance, but nevertheless, he predicted an eclipse, and this impressed his fellow Indians. So he had a spiritual hold on the Indians, the two of them, Tecumseh and the Prophet. They believed that the problem with the Indians was they were leaving their old ways of living, and they must return to their old ways of living. I actually have to say I can feel sorry for them, but nevertheless. Each of you have to make up your own minds what you think about it, but nevertheless, this might, well, okay, I'll say I really believe that the way the Indians were living was wrong. However, each of you can make up your own minds, but the Tecumseh tried to persuade them to go back to living the way they had before. Thomas Jefferson believed that Tecumseh would ally himself with Canada and threaten the western part of the United States. William Henry Harrison was sent out west to oppose Tecumseh. Tecumseh participated in several battles against the white men, whom he called the Long Knives. Finally, he was killed. And after that, no Indian leader east of the Mississippi would ever again try to overthrow the whites. Now, we had some leaders west of the Mississippi, a couple of generations later, who tried it. Sitting Bull, Rain in the Face, Crazy Horse. Some of you might have heard of some of these Indians, but these Indians tried to overthrow the white men west of Mississippi. But Tecumseh led the last Indian uprising, but the problem was it was simply too late. Morally, he was on high ground for two reasons. Number one, the land had been the Indians' land first, and number two, the white man was not keeping his treaties. You probably all heard me say that before. But the other side of it, the fighting was suicide. All right. The election of 1800 has been called the Revolution of 1800. It was the first time in American history where a man from one party peacefully handed over the presidency to a man from another party. The two men by this time did not like each other. They had been friends back during the Revolutionary War days. Then they became enemies. Later in life, they became friends again in their old age. Even though a lot of Federalists were turning against him, John Adams ran on the Federalist ticket. Hamilton again tried to get the Federalists to support Pinckney. With the Federalists divided, Adams lost. Now, folks, there have been many a time in history where a presidential candidate has lost because his party split their vote. In 1992, Ross Perot split the Republican vote and got Bill Clinton elected. Abraham Lincoln was elected because the Democrats split their vote. Woodrow Wilson was elected because the Republicans split their vote. More than once in history, when one party splits its vote, so Alexander Hamilton had a lot to do with John Adams losing the presidency. Now, here was the problem with the way that they balloted. The electors this time the electors who voted for Adams United, they put John Adams in the same ballot as Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr was running with John Adams as his vice president. Now, every elector had meant for John Adams to be president and Aaron Burr vice president. Burr knew that, But nevertheless, Burr, being a scoundrel, said, I tied with Adams. According to the Constitution, the election must go to the House of Representatives, where Burr thought he had a chance to win. Well, the House balloted and balloted, and nobody could get a majority. They balloted again, nobody could get a majority. Your book calls Burr a scoundrel, ever a scoundrel, refused to concede the election. Well, finally, Alexander Hamilton stepped in. Alexander Hamilton said, well, actually, no, wait a minute. Let me change it. This was not John Adams, this was Thomas Jefferson. I'm sorry about that, folks. Hamilton said, I don't like Jefferson, I don't like Burr, but I like Burr even less than I like Jefferson. So he persuaded a bunch of Federalists to not vote at all. And that way it guaranteed that Thomas Jefferson got the presidency and Aaron Burr became vice president, which was what the electors had meant in the first place. But in the meantime, Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr began to hurl insults at each other. Now, let me ask you, in this morning's class, nobody knew. Have any of you ever heard of Aaron Burr and know what he's famous for? Any of you at all? Yes?
He killed Alexander Hamilton.
He killed Alexander Hamilton in a duel. At least one person in my 2 classes knew that. Thank you. One of you, yes. He wound up killing Hamilton in a duel. Now, the 2 men exchanged bitter feuding over the next few years. Then in 1804, Aaron Burr knew that Thomas Jefferson was never going to run with him. So Aaron Burr decided to run for governor of New York. Alexander Hamilton, who was himself from New York, said, I don't want Aaron Burr to be my governor. I mean, Burr was a scoundrel, purely and simply. And the 2 men hurled insults at each other that were so bad, I'm not going to repeat them here, and both men were probably, both Alexander Hamilton and Aaron Burr were probably both guilty of a lot of the stuff they were accused of. But finally, Aaron Burr wrote a letter to Hamilton challenging Hamilton to a duel. In those days, if you were issued a challenge, you were expected to show up. Now later, dueling became unpopular, and when Andrew Jackson issued a challenge to Henry Clay said, I don't believe in duels. I'm not going to fight you in a duel. I'm not going to show up. Henry Clay refused to show up. But Hamilton believed he was bound by honor to go and show up at least. Now, since Aaron Burr had done the challenging, that meant that Hamilton got to choose the weapons. So Hamilton chose that they would fight with 2 pistols. We still have the pistols to this day. But they fought with pistols. And then Hamilton would get the first shot off. Now, if Hamilton had shot straight in the air, Burr was supposed to shoot in the air, and the 2 men were to shake hands and forget all about their bitterness. Well, Hamilton's shot went in the trees above Burr's head, you might say at a 45-degree angle. It did not go straight up. We do not know what Hamilton's intent was. It has been said that it shows that Hamilton did not intend to shoot Burr. And it was Burr's turn to shoot, and Burr shot to kill. Hamilton was seriously wounded and died the next day. It was 1804. Now in 2004, 200 years later, the descendants of Hamilton and Burr met. The descendants of Burr apologized to the descendants of Hamilton. But one of the descendants of Burr made an interesting statement. He said, Hamilton had no reason to dislike Burr. Yes, he did. Burr was a scoundrel. Pure and simple. But anyway, that's jumping ahead of the story just a little bit now. But well, the Revolution of 1800, where that Thomas Jefferson was elected president, and John Adams handed the government over to him peacefully, this revolution did nothing to help the slaves, folk. Not anything. All right. Now, in the meantime, there was a slave who got together a bunch of slaves in Virginia to plan a rebellion. Gabriel might have been, but you can't prove it, he might have been influenced by news of the rebellion, slave rebellion in Haiti. The slave owners tried to keep that news from their slaves, but these slaves would get together, particularly on Sundays when they were let off work, and They were allowed to walk around and move around even from one plantation to another. And we don't know what news Gabriel might have gotten from Haiti. Nevertheless, Gabriel's plot was discovered. A thunderstorm came up on the day that the rebellion was supposed to occur. Some nervous slaves told their owners, believing that this was God's way of saying, better not do it. It struck fear in the hearts of a whole lot of southern slave owners, even though the rebellion never actually materialized. Governor James Monroe, who later became president, hung a bunch of slaves, but then Vice President Thomas Jefferson wrote a letter to James Monroe saying, instead deport them, send them out of the country, send them to the West Indies, but just simply get rid of them that way, but don't hang any more of them. This is going to possibly stir up more rebellion. Governor Monroe listened to him, and this was one of two rebellions now that scared the Southerners. The other one we'll talk about later was Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. All right. By the time Jefferson got to Washington, got in office, the capital was in Washington. The first president to live in the president's mansion, what is today called the White House, was John Adams. And there's a certain room at the White House where it's known that Mrs. Adams used to hang out her wash. She'd wash her clothes and hang her wash in a certain room because it was too cold outside during the winter time, so the clothes would have frozen over. And I'm old enough to remember my mother hanging her clothes out, and if it froze while the clothes were hanging, which sometimes it did, the clothes become icy and stiff. But anyway, now the White House was not finished when Jefferson moved in, but if Jefferson's wife had died, so Jefferson saw no reason to finish work in the White House, so during the 8 years he was in office, very little work was done. Now the next president, James Madison, had a wife named Dolly who was known for liking extravagance and artwork. Dolly Madison helped get the White House finished, or it was then called the President's Mansion. It became the White House later. Thomas Jefferson met with high-ranking officials dressed in his slippers, in other words, basically in his night clothes. He would often answer the door to the White House when it was knocked on, dressed in night clothes. He envisioned a nation of farmers. Now, in view of what actually happened, seems somewhat, well, it's interesting to look at what these people hoped for and then look at what actually occurred. The nation did not become a nation of farmers, but he believed that a man could work his farm and slowly gain wealth. He said this is the cornerstone of liberty and democracy, where a man gradually and slowly builds up his wealth by working a farm with his family. And as his children grow up, they begin to help out on the farm. And as he has more children, they begin to help out on the farm. He believed that this was a way that ordinary men could become wealthy. He abolished all federal taxes. He said the government from here on is going to be financed by the sale of Western lands and tariffs, or custom duties, import duties. Now, eventually, Western lands that could be sold was going to run out, but Jefferson seemed to think that those lands would last forever. And eventually, too, about 100 years after Jefferson left office, the federal government passed an income tax law. And again, I don't know how the federal government today could do without the income tax law. Jefferson reduced the national debt. Government jobs were kept to a minimum. He had a secretary named Meriwether Lewis. Now keep in mind, in those days, secretaries are almost always men. But he even paid Meriwether Lewis out of his own pockets, even though he had the right to pay his personal secretary out of government money, as Washington did and Adams did. But Jefferson, no, I'm going to pay him out of my own pockets to save government money. Now, early in his administration, something happened. John Adams, the election occurred in November, but it was probably January or February before John Adams knew he'd lost, owing to the fact that I mean, by this time there were states beyond the Appalachian. Ohio was a state, and I believe Kentucky was a state. Tennessee was a state. So we had states beyond the Appalachian Mountains. And communication was really slow, and it took a long time for the votes to be counted and maybe recounted, and then the tally of the votes to be sent in. So John Adams was slow at appointing office officials, but he decided the way that we Federalists are going to keep control. I mean, the Federalists had lost the presidency, they'd lost in the House and lost the Senate, but he was going to make sure the Federalists kept control of the judiciary. So he appointed a bunch of judges, and they were called midnight judges because John Adams was known to be sitting up in his office at midnight, working by candlelight, working away, trying to get those appointments made, like a lot of college students do their papers, and burning midnight oil. But anyway, even that. But he was working at midnight just the night before the inauguration of Jefferson. And then he put the appointments in an envelope and put them in the mailroom. And then he left Washington for home. He had a long trip to make to get back up to his home up in New England. Well, the next Secretary of State, James Madison by name, who became president after Jefferson, he said, I'm not going to deliver that mail. I'm not going to deliver those appointments. So one of the judges, a man named Marbury, said, hey, I was appointed, I know I was appointed, I was told I was going to be appointed, and I feel like I have a right to a judgeship. So Marbury took his case to court. The case Marbury versus Madison is one of the most famous cases in the Supreme Court history. To make a long story short, they said the Supreme Court could strike down a law that it believed was unconstitutional. This changed the courts from the weakest branch of government to the strongest. Not everybody was happy with it, particularly Thomas Jefferson himself was unhappy with it, but there was nothing much he could do about it. The Supreme Court never used this right until 1857. They never used it again. Today they use it right and left. Now when I was taking government in college, they said only some 80 federal laws had ever been declared unconstitutional. Today, hundreds of federal laws have been declared unconstitutional. We call it checks and balances, folk, but I've got to ask you, the last time a Supreme Court case was overturned by a constitutional amendment was in 1913. Been a long time. Nobody alive remembers it. When Congress passed an income tax bill, the Supreme Court ruled it unconstitutional, so Congress passed the income tax amendment. The 16th Amendment, I believe, that gave them the right to pay income tax. Folk, that is not what I call checks and balances. The courts can rule 5-4, and it takes 2/3 of the House and Senate and 3/4 of the states to overturn it. It's almost impossible. The Supreme Court makes all of our moral decisions for us. Our elected officials don't. That we, the people, have no say-so. And some people said the Supreme Court rules us with more tyranny than George III ever would have, even if he could have. As they have made some decisions that have made it difficult for police to enforce laws or to arrest people. And basically decisions that have undercut family life and made our public schools impossible to educate. If anyone wants to comment, your comments are welcome. I did have one student say, who I thought was liberal, he said it's going to someday take a president who will have the guts to stand up to the Supreme Court and say, no, we don't obey your law. The Supreme Court was not given this right in the Constitution, folk. They usurped it. We've not had a president who dared stand up to them since Andrew Jackson did, and he was soundly condemned by historians for it. All right. Louisiana Purchase. Wrong map. This one. In France, Napoleon needed money to conduct his wars. France had wound up squeezing all this territory here from Spain. And they decided, Napoleon decided to sell it, $15 million, which Napoleon desperately needed. It has been said that Napoleon was at his bathtub. Now, Napoleon worked 20 hours a day and only slept 4, and he even worked from his bathtub. He had his brothers around him. He governed with the aid of his brothers, but he had his brother around him, and he signed the Louisiana Purchase from his bathtub, so it's been said. But he sold all this territory. Now, Thomas Jefferson, as a young man, had been a rebel. As an old man, he was a staunch conservative, and he did not know, do I really have the right to do this as president? He couldn't find anywhere in the Constitution that gave him that right, but finally he decided to go ahead anyway because it was too big of a bargain. Just like Thomas Jefferson opposed the bank because the Constitution didn't give the country the right to make a bank, Jefferson believed that the Constitution should be interpreted strictly, but he broke his own rules when he purchased this territory. Then he sent his personal secretary, Meriwether Lewis, and Lewis's partner, William Clark. He sent those 2 men out to observe it. Now, they started here in Missouri, and they went all the way to what is today the state of Washington. They heard the roar of the Pacific Ocean. They found the Snake River, but their job was to find out what kind of plants and animals lived here. The Spanish were highly concerned, so Spain had Mexico at this time. Spain sent an army out here to look for Lewis and Clark. The Spanish army never found them. I mean, this territory is vast, very huge. It almost doubled the size of the United States. Huge territory, and wound up being made into several states. It did not include what is today Texas or Arizona, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, or California, but did include much of the rest of the territory that we have today that's west of the Mississippi River. Now they took along an Indian woman named Sacagawea, and her presence kept the Indians that they encountered friendly. The Indians would meet them and greet them dressed in light-colored paint, mostly yellow. The yellow paint symbolized that it was peace between them and her. So again, her presence was highly influential. And in 2004, we again remember the Lewis and Clark expedition. New England opposed the purchase because, I mean, here's what they said. I mean, New England had at one time felt like they were a big part of the country, but they looked on a map and said, hey, we're just going to be a tiny little part of the nation if this is done. I mean, and they were right. But New England is still important, but they're not a major part of the country anymore. Again, it was just part of the process of getting bigger. They were acclaimed national heroes when the 2 men returned. And they had established initially favorable relations with the Indians they met. Unfortunately, though, now I've got to say this, getting along with people like the Indians proved to be virtually impossible. The Indians and Europeans were different and would be different. And the two were going to have a difficult time coming together in a common meeting ground. In 1804, the Federalists had lost a big leader when they lost Alexander Hamilton in a duel with Vice President Aaron Burr. Vice President Aaron Burr's political career, though, was dead. He thought, if I can just get Hamilton out of the way, I'll go on to become president. Wrong. He killed Hamilton, and neither the Federalists nor Republicans would have anything to do with him. He was wanted for murder in both New York and New Jersey. He wound up going down the Mississippi River and trying to set up a state in Louisiana. But he was caught and brought back, but the Supreme Court exonerated him and turned him loose. All right. England and France went to war again. Again, Napoleon was involved. This time, both England and France restricted American shipping. The British began to stop American ships, and the captain didn't know whether they were British or not, but the captain would say, "You're a deserting British seaman. You come on board my ship and fight with the British Navy." There was nothing the man could do but go aboard and fight. This upset a whole lot of Americans because a lot of the sailors who were impressed had never served in the British Navy, and some of them even were American citizens. And this made the blood of a lot of Americans boil. So Jefferson and Madison got the Embargo Act of 1807 passed. The act forbade any Americans to trade abroad with anyone, forbade American ships to leave port. This wound up being an economic disaster. Great Britain simply turned to other nations for trade. Unemployment rose. It rose in the United States, especially New England was really, really hard hit by the Embargo Act. The cry went up, take off the embargo. As the economy worsened, the Federalist Party began gaining strength. So Thomas Jefferson finally lifted the embargo. And he simply said, okay, what we'll do, we'll only forbid trade with Britain and France, but you can go anywhere else you want to. So what the merchant captains would do, they would get out of sight. They'd take off saying, we're going to go to Spain, we're going to go to Holland, or we're going to the West Indies, and then once out of port, they'd often head for both England or for England or France. Illegal trade was done with both nations, but at least the economy of the United States improved thanks to the lifting of the embargo. Now, something else, folks, that this book chooses to not mention, but I'm at least going to mention it. The first war we fought was after the Revolution was not the War of 1812. Before the War of 1812, we fought a war with people in the North Mediterranean called the Barbary Pirates. All right, I'll tell you, these were Muslim countries. And they would come in and capture a bunch of ships. And in order to keep your ships from being captured, you had to pay these people a bribe. Thomas Jefferson decided, I'm not going to pay a bribe, and a cry went up among millions for defense, but not 1 cent for bribes. The war with the Barbary Pirates lasted for 4 years. And it led to an ending of the pirates in the Mediterranean. Eventually the rest of the European nations got involved and decided, hey, we're not going to keep paying bribes to these countries to keep them off our shipping. Now again, I'm at least going to mention it. If you know, the Marines hymn starts out from the halls of Montezuma to the shores of Tripoli. The shores of Tripoli is a reference to the war with the Barbary Pirates. Again, your book chooses not to mention it for whatever reason, but I'll at least give it some mention. All right, James Madison. James Madison won the election of 1808. James Madison goes down in history as being the smallest president we ever had. The high school I went to is named after him, Madison High School. They had a mass shooting about 4 years ago, which most of you probably don't even remember, but anyway, it's still there. James Madison. And one man went around looking at all the tombs of all the presidents, and the only one he saw was in an ordinary grave and somewhat neglected grave site, grown over, and just a little stone to mark it, was James Madison's. Some of our presidents have really magnificent tombs, but James Madison, not much. Even though he was not the worst president we ever had, but he got us involved in a war that he could have avoided. And this is a blight on his name from that day till this. The French would continue to seize American ships. The British also did. And in 1811, all right, Congress, the House of Representatives is elected every 2 years. If I hadn't mentioned that before, I need to now. The Senate is elected every 6 years. the president every 4 years. Most of you, I hope, know that, or will know it if you see it on a test. Some of you probably will, especially since I made it up today. Anyway, president served for 4 years, but the House had an election in 1810. Now, the president was not elected in 1810, but the House was. So the men who won the election of 1810 took office in 1811, and for the first time you had young men, Henry Clay and John C. Calhoun,